At first it was only a sound, so small you could mistake it for a settling house, a tap inside the walls of a narrow bedroom in a two-story home in Cottage City, Maryland. January cold pressed against the windows until the panes trembled. Somewhere a faucet dripped with the stubborn rhythm of a metronome. The boy lay awake, 10, 11, 12 years old. It depended on who was asked. The light from the street lamp climbed and fell across his desk over the polished board his aunt had given him. A board with letters and numbers and a little planchette that moved when he and his aunt placed their fingers upon it and laughed at the way it seemed to know. By the end of that month, Aunt Harriet was dead. She had been the crackle of warmth in the house, with a drawer full of oddities, spiritualist pamphlets, postcards, a board game she liked to call a talking board, and a way of telling stories that made electricity in the air. After they buried her in the brittle winter ground, the boy kept listening. The taps didn't stop. They learned to answer questions. His mother, a Lutheran woman with careful hands, did not accuse the void of malice. She called for the plumber, then an exterminator. The plumber knocked the pipes and shook his head. The exterminator set traps. No mice, no leaks, only the tapping, which now moved from the walls to the underside of the mattress like impatient fingers drumming. At night, the bed shook. At breakfast, the boy's chair scraped by itself across the linoleum and halted as if someone had yanked it back with a string. He would glance over his shoulder and find nothing but a cold draft where a moment earlier the kitchen felt warm. Neighbors heard it through the thin winter air. Family came to sit up late in the narrow hall outside the boys' room and watch the crucifix tremble. Once, they said, a painting slid down the wall with the inexorable gravity of a slow avalanche and thumped to the floor. In February, the mother called the family pastor, a careful man named Luther Miles Schulze, who arrived with the calm of one used to grief and strangeness. He set his hat on the hall table and asked to see where the trouble began. They led him down a hallway where the wallpaper had bubbled from steam many winters ago and into the boy S room. The bed frame was iron. The mattress was thin. The pastor sat on the edge and asked the room to be still. The bed answered with a sudden shudder that jolted the legs off the floor, hard enough for the pastor's hat to tumble in the hall. When he leaned close to a tremoring bedside lamp, he could hear, faint as breath, the wire inside the switch whisper against itself. He did not scream. He nodded, and the boy's mother squeezed her hands together until the knuckles whitened. The pastor prayed, and the air in the room gathered itself, dense and awkward, as if the house had become too small. That night, the knocking grew insistent. The boy lay flat and watched the ceiling. The planchette moved under his fingers when he placed them against it, or perhaps his fingers moved because he needed something to turn in his favor. It didn't matter which. He asked, "Are you there?" And something in the room answered by banging so hard the bed chattered against the floorboards and the water glass on the nightstand shimmied to the edge, toppled, and shattered on the rug. The family's hope migrated without them. It drifted to a hospital in Washington, rumors later said, where a Catholic priest, young, determined, had been given permission to attempt a rite from the Roman ritual. The rite did not last. People who would be interviewed decades later said a metal spring sprang free from the boy S mattress and slashed the priest S forearm open. Blood filled his sleeve. The ritual stopped. The boy's face sank, calm for a moment, as if relieved of an obligation, then pinched into a stubborn child's scowl. The bed shook again. By March, fatigue hung over the house like a sheet. The boy woke with scratches across his torso that his mother swore had not been there when she tucked him in. Thin, red welts, as if a cat had dragged a paw across his skin from shoulder to hip. One afternoon, with sunlight fingered through the slats of the blinds and the kitchen clock ticking loud enough to goad, the boy screamed. His mother found him on the floor, back arched. When she reached him, his shirt lifted, and across his stomach, letters glowed up in the reddened skin. L-O-U. The last letters rose like bruises that hadn't yet made up their mind. I-S. The family stared. His uncle traced the letters with a shaking finger and did not finish the word out loud. They had relatives in St. Louis. The mother called. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she explained through static the thumps, the bed, the words. Across 1,000 miles, a cousin said, "Just come," and something in the phone line cracked once like a knuckle. The pastor, cautious, warned them to seek doctors, to rest, to pray. The boy did not sleep. On a March evening with cold, the color of tin, they packed the car for the station and brought only what they could carry. A suitcase, a worn ecclesiastical book the pastor pressed into the mother's hands, though it was not from her tradition, and the boy, whose gaze ticked to corners where no one else could see. In the station, their breath made ghosts. The boy stood beside a wooden bench that had been varnished too many times and scratched the itchy skin of his forearm, while his mother repined with a coin in the ticket window, brass tray. When the train arrived, it moaned and shouldered the air aside, and they climbed aboard into light that slanted like weather. The rails stretched west. On the first night, the boy's mother woke to a knocking from beneath their seats. On the second night, a porter passed their berth and found the boy bunk thrashing while he lay atop it, eyes open. On the third night, as the Missouri River sketched a black line along the edge of a sky that would not dawn, the boy lifted his shirt, and the mother saw the marks brighten again along the ribs rising like surfacing fish, spelling out the word that had sent them hurtling across the country. L, then O, the line of U, the curl of I, the hard hiss of S. Outside, lights marched slowly toward them as St. Louis woke and stretched, church towers pricking the horizon like pins. And before morning, the boy's body stiffened in his berth, so hard the bunk slammed against the wall, and someone in the next car shouted. Then he went slack, breath-shallow eyes latched onto the narrow seam above him, as within his skin another letter began to rise, undecided, tracing the start of a new word as the train drew into a city that had already been warned. The station air was a cold wash of metal and coffee. The family stepped into Missouri light and were gathered at once by their kin, familiar faces, concerned eyes, who shepherded them into the sheltered quiet of a sedan and drove north along blocks of winter-torn sidewalks and elms whose bark peeled in ragged sleeves. The streets gave way to a neighborhood of tidy houses and front stoops polished by decades of footsteps. The house they would use, an aunt's, a cousin's, stood on a corner in Belnor with a modest bedroom and a bed that would soon learn to tremble. On Grand Boulevard, a dark, bricked church lifted its lace of stone against the sky, St. Francis Xavier, the college church, adjacent to St. Louis University. Inside its vestry that afternoon, a Jesuit priest of middle years, William Bowdern, poured coffee into a cup and took a breath that felt like standing on a ship's deck. He had known talk of this boy. He had read the authorization from the archdiocese after quiet argument, after consultations and caution stacked like sandbags. He had read the old Latin words the way a surgeon examines a scalpel, respectfully, without sentiment. With him was another Jesuit younger, Raymond Bishop, who would keep a diary in a firm hand and record what they saw, and, when it became necessary, a scholastic, a tall young man named Walter Halloran, whose job would be simple and impossible: to hold on. They arrived at the house with an assistant and a black bag that did not, could not, carry all that would be asked. The boy lay on the bed, his hair damp at the temples. He glanced at the priests and blinked his ordinary eyes. There was nothing extraordinary in him then, only exhaustion. The men touched the cold metal of his bed frame to ground themselves, unpacked cloth and book, and began the rite in a voice pitched not to spook. When Father Bowdern sprinkled holy water, the boy's shoulders twitched as if splashed by something far colder. When the priest placed a crucifix on the bed, the mattress bucked. Halloran, surprised, took hold of the boy's wrists and found them whipcord strong. Lacquered beads rattled. The wallpaper seemed to flex like a breathing lung. The older priest's voice, threaded Latin through air, turned woolen with tension. The words summoned and rebuked, named and bound, commanded to depart what they were not yet certain had arrived. The boy's face pinched into a rictus. In a voice that was somehow both raw and careful, he spat phrases that sounded like prayers, played backward. He parroted Latin syllables as if he had overheard them for years, then shredded them with laughter. When the priest pressed a relic to the boy's stomach, he yelped and arched and went rigid until the room vibrated with the bed frame. Legs hammering the floor. Each night it was the same, and worse. Bishop's diary filled the child's abnormally violent reactions, scratch marks appearing in the presence of all, words surfacing, sometimes simple, sometimes obscene. No school tomorrow, someone later said they saw, rising along his rib cage after a particularly violent evening, and it would sound like gallows humor if there had been any. Neighbors grew accustomed to the strange procession of men who arrived after dark and left, dawn-stricken, faces caved with fatigue. The boy learned to watch them arrive with a smirk that was sometimes his and sometimes borrowed. He clawed the bedding until his nails split. He spat with cruel accuracy. He purred once in a pressure of silence. Between prayers, he whispered to Halloran in a voice of gentle mockery, calling him by a nickname he'd used as a boy in Wisconsin, a name no one in St. Louis could have known. And the young scholastic blinked because it was the sound of a home he hadn't yet admitted he missed. And then, the injuries. A night when the boy got a hand free and reached under the mattress, found a coil of wire, and snapped it loose. The bed groaned. A spring sang out and bit into the air like a blade. Bishop ducked. Halloran wasn't quick enough. He came away with a bruise that would purple his face and a swelling along the bridge of his nose, a future crookedness he would later call a souvenir. The rite continued. It could not continue there forever. family life thinned to its membrane. Dishes went unwashed. The boy's cousins tiptoed. When dawn came, the little room had a scorched feeling, like a kitchen after a grease fire, everything coated in something invisible and barely lifted away. The priests made a decision. The Alexian brothers would admit the boy to their hospital. They had a quiet room that could be guarded. The bed would be bolted. The sacristy would be nearby. They would limit who came and went, not to cloak the stir in secrecy, but to seal it off, the way you close a door against a house fire and pray the smoke does not find the vents. On the day of the transfer, the boy sat up when he hadn't to moved in hours and stared at the crucifix on the wall. He grinned, his mouth wrong, and began to whistle the tune of a hymn none of the men had yet sung aloud in his presence. The melody was stubborn and cheerful, a village sun in winter. Then he took the crucifix in both hands and bent it until the metal sounded like a cry. He said, clear and low, "You can't," and the light on the windowsill moved as if the sun had been jolted. The hospital took him in the evening of a long day. The corridors were clean in the way of places where illnesses had been scrubbed until the tile shone. The room they gave him was not much. A narrow bed, a crucifix that would not be bent, a night table, a window onto a brick wall. A nurse would later swear a rosary became too hot to hold. A brother would later testify he saw marks rise on the boy's skin, exactly as if written from the inside out. The priests decided the boy would be watched in shifts. Night fell like a dropped curtain. They began again. The Roman ritual's phrases peeled from Bowdern's lips. He spoke not like a magician, and not like a man who believed beyond doubt, but like a man who understood that when something is broken, you use the tools your people judge to have worked. The boy convulsed, then stilled. He mouthed words the older man refused to write down. He smiled and said nothing when asked a question. Hours folded into hours. The bed was strong, and then, on a night that must be written somewhere in the margins of the world, the boy's back arched, and the muscles in his neck banded like ropes. He hissed a name no one had taught him. When the pain passed, he slumped, slack, a child again. His lips moved without sound. A heat rose off his skin that fogged the window and made droplets run. Bowdern placed his fingers lightly on the boy's forehead and whispered into a silence so heavy it had mass. After that, the phenomenon changed shape. He slept only when they prayed aloud. He woke ravening and then refused to eat. When he closed his eyes, the scratches came. Words rose that none of them wanted to see. And then something else. In one of the last nights before the week they would later remember as the week that would decide them, the boy's mouth opened and a voice came that was not his, not the mimicking child, not the taunting thing they had come to dread, but something pale and scraped and exhausted. It called a name, not of a priest, but of an angel. It said it only once, as if to test the air. And on that name, the light in the room seemed to tilt, and the floor met their feet a half-inch to the left of where they expected it. The men looked at one another as if the evening had just drawn a knife and asked for volunteers, and they squared themselves to something they could not see because there was nothing else to do, and began to speak again. The room at the Alexian brothers had learned the rhythm, the scrape of a chair, the priest's breath, gathering under syllables that had been said in wood-walled churches and floodlit cathedrals, and in cellars where men whispered so as not to wake their neighbors. The boy's breathing met the prayers in counterpoint. On nights when he slept, his chest rose and fell like a bellows. On nights when he didn't, the breath stuttered, catching, until even the quiet brothers in the corridor found themselves holding their own. The diary kept pace. Father Raymond Bishop's hand was steady, even as the night's progress bucked and swayed. He wrote what could be recorded without betraying confidences. The times, the phenomenology, the strange way the scratches ceased when the boy S arms were pinned, only to reappear along the thighs, along the back, places no child could reach. He wrote of a voice that slid up and down registers like an organist practicing scales. He wrote of the nausea that came over the room at exactly the same moment each night, a prickling at the base of the skull he could almost time by. He wrote of the way the boy S eyes would fix on a corner and watch an empty patch of air with the careful dread of someone waiting for a glass to fall. Every faith tradition keeps a protocol for when the world misbehaves. The men followed theirs. They checked pulse and temperature, consulted doctors when marks rose, moved the boy into different rooms to ensure no trick of the architecture. When they asked his parents, again, if there had been mental illness or trauma, they were told what they had been told before. Grief had indeed come to live with them this winter, but nothing that seemed to deserve this. Daylight thinned the thing's authority. The boy sat up under omelets and broth and quiet jokes, and he could smile, briefly, as if trying to remind his face how to do it. He played games with a rubber ball, not catching so much as bouncing, thump, 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 on the hospital's polished floor. When a nurse asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, he shrugged, a boy again, and said something ordinary, as if his future had already escaped out a window somewhere and waited for him down on the sidewalk. Night, though. Night is when floors remember how to groan. Night is when the wardrobe casts a shadow that insists on being seen. On one such night, after a day of relative ease, the boy asked for water and drank it quickly and then grasped at his throat. His face reddened. He coughed, gagged, retched. Nothing came up, then went limp, then jerked back in a convulsion as his jaw clenched and a sound buckled out of his chest like a sub-basement door torn from its hinges. The room answered by contracting, each face turning down a shade. The response was as old as the rite. The priest laid hand to forehead and spoke again, and when the boy's eyes rolled back, he said the word he had refused to write the previous week. The floor remembered them. This is where the story often grows teeth it never had, where sulfur is rumored, where furniture turns somersaults. The truth, even if you believe every word of what was written in that diary, is less cinematic and far more unnerving. Most of the time, nothing happened at all. They sat and prayed and waited while a child lay on a bed and twitched and whispered. And then, now and then, the room would tilt in such a way as to make the hair on your arms lift. On a Sunday near Palm Sunday, the boy's skin bloomed with an X. It rose across his chest from shoulder to opposite hip, and for hours it pulsed above the surface of his skin like something trying to squeeze through. He says it means 10, someone wrote. Another thought it meant something else, a crossing out, a refusal. The boy laughed when they argued. He followed their eyes down to the X and looked, for a moment, surprised. When they asked, patient, who was there with him, he murmured a name that made one of the brothers cross himself out of reflex. The name turned to a hiss and then to a hum. The young scholastic, Halloran, had taken to stepping forward at the moments when a man was needed to become weight. He held wrists, shoulders, ankles, and when the boy thrashed, he bore it, absorbing kicks and scratching until his arms bore constellations of shallow cuts. Later, he would be asked whether he saw words rise unambiguously, and he would answer like a good witness. He saw marks. He saw lines. Sometimes they could be read. Sometimes they could not be. And sometimes men saw what they feared and made sense out of it. He would insist he did not hear fluent Latin, escape a boy who had never been taught it. He heard mimicry, of the sort any boy capable of learning a hymn can manage. He heard rage. He heard sadness. What he could not explain, and would not attempt to, was the force with which the bed shook when no other explanation held. In the quiet hours before Good Friday, the boy whispered the name he had tested earlier. Michael, he said simply, as if calling for an elder brother, across a schoolyard crowded with noise. The priests paused. Father Bodern made the decision a parish priest makes when a child looks to him as if he might be an answer and knows he is only a channel. He opened the book to the prayers that name the archangel, not as gentle, but as soldier, and said them in a voice tuned like a carpenter's blade. The boy snapped awake and spoke with a clarity that had eluded him for weeks. He wants, he said, and swallowed, and then, he wants you to finish. The boy's face slackened as if with relief. Halloran glanced at Bishop, whose pen hovered above paper and did not move. They understood what was being asked of them. They understood they were being drawn into a narrative older than any city in which they stood, that their role required nothing like brilliance and everything like endurance. The next evening, they would begin again. They would continue to speak to that which would not answer, except in blows and scratches. They would invoke a name rare in Lutheran parlors and Catholic kitchens alike, and they would ask, finally, not for persuasion, not for proof, but for an exit. On a night that smelled of rain, they began the prayer that asks the oldest of the old stories to decline its grip. The room felt like the second before a piece of glass breaks, tension in every molecule. The boy's arms strained against the straps, and the muscles in his neck stood up like ropes under canvas. Michael, he said once, quiet as a bedtime prayer. Michael, said the priest, louder. Silence came down about them, as if someone had laid a heavy cloth over the hospital. They could hear each other breathe. And then the boy's eyes snapped open and fixed on a point just above Father Bodern's right shoulder with an attention so fierce it made everyone turn to see what wasn't there. And he said, in a voice that belonged to someone who had just remembered his own name, the words broke off in a sound that was not a word at all, a deep grinding, as if an old door were being opened on rusted hinges, deep in the building's bones. The bed heaved. The boy's body pitched against the straps with precision, not frantic now, but purposeful, an animal testing each knot in turn. Halloran leaned his weight in, the cords in his forearms rising like new rail lines. Bishop's pen touched paper and then lifted without writing. The ritual's next phrases waited on Bodern's tongue like a held breath. Sometimes terror arrives as cacophony. Sometimes it enters as a quiet that tightens screws inside the skull. The hospital room filled with the latter. No one spoke. The light from the corridor became a scissored wedge on the floor. You could hear the deep night plumbing measure the building's pulse. Outside, a patrol car cruised past with its radio low, a murmur under the city's drowsing. Inside, everything waited. Michael, the priest said again, his voice broom stiff, sweeping the room of excuses. His Latin took on a carpenter's cadence, cut to fit the wood at hand. He invoked in one breath a chain of names the church has kept written for such nights, and in the next fired a single word into the quiet like a bolt. Impera, command. What followed took long minutes that would later be remembered as a single, sharp instant. The boy's speech returned, but not like before, not the teased out mockery, not the parroting Latin. It came like dictation. His mouth formed words with a soldier's efficiency. The voice new and not his. Satan, Satan, it said, and then distinctly, as if read from a page held before him, I am Saint Michael, and I command you and the other evil spirits to leave this body in the name of Dominus. Bishop's hand trembled for the first time. Halloran stared, forgetting for a fraction of a second to do his job, his grip loosening until the boy's left hand slid an inch, then stopped. Father Bodern did not interrupt. He let the words, now pouring from the boy's mouth in clipped precision, run to their end. In the name of Christ, and in the name of the Almighty God. Now, and with now, as if a cue had been delivered unseen, the boy's body recoiled in a single convulsion that slammed his head back so hard the bed frame shrieked. He went rigid, from scalp to heel, as if strung like a bow. The room went colder. Breath plumed. The crucifix's shadow thickened along the wall and pivoted slowly, as if a hand had turned a lamp. The boy's lips drew back from his teeth in a grin the way a wound opens. And then there was a quiet, like the quiet after a roadside accident, when everyone is counting the heartbeats they can hear and trying to decide whether they can move. The relapse, when it came, was small, just a single word, a vile word, spat with exquisite clarity at the oldest priest in the room, as if to draw a response and break the rite's pace. It did not work. Bodern, eyes half closed, went on as if to walk through a storm by keeping his boots in the middle of the road, and the syllables of Latin fell like hammer strikes. The brothers in the corridor, though they had been told not to watch, had pressed themselves closer to the window glass and peered past their own reflections, knuckles turning bloodless as they gripped the frame. Something knocked from under the bed. Once, twice, 3 times in a kind of sarcastic applause. The boy barked laughter that was not his. The priest repeated the command, naming with the peculiar boldness of ancient forms the hierarchy of those meant to be commanded. Now, he said again, because the night had come to it, and refused to step aside. Time thickened. The boy's eyes tracked something moving along the upper wall of the room, a presence climbing above their heads, like a shadow insect, clinging. He whispered names, little ones, the sort of names you give to personal demons when you rug a child and don't know better, the sort of names that make adults want to feel ridiculous for allowing themselves to be moved. Then he screamed, not loud, but high, as if the thing he watched had dropped suddenly to the ground beside him. The brothers had prepared holy oil, had set aside linen, had both in drawers that slid silently and closed with a whisper. When they drew them, their hands shook. The city outside shrugged its shoulders at the hour and turned. The building made the long rattling yawn of a waking giant. Bishop wrote one line, short and insufficient, because some moments are too thick to be shepherded into ink. April 18th, dreadful struggle. It had been weeks of prayer, of exhaustion, of the boy's father sitting on chairs with his head in his hands, the mother's quiet weeping behind a bathroom door, of men who were not the boy's family learning the strange tenderness of drilling holes in bed frames to accept extra bolts. It had been weeks of the thing inside the room learning the men's patience and testing it like a lock. Now all of it pressed toward an edge. The Holy Week prayers had come, had gone. Easter had arrived with its gaudy promise and found them unimpressed by tulips and sugar. The morning had been ordinary. The night was not. They would later tell it as a moment of sudden clarity. Either this would end tonight or it would not end at all. Men came with that in their eyes and set their chairs again where they had set them a dozen times before. The crucifix was lifted and gently pressed again to the boy's chest. The room took a breath, and in that breath lived 3 months of a family's uncomprehending endurance, and the entire weight of one faith's quiet confidence, and all of the ancient world's insistence that in the contest between will and world words could matter. Then the boy's face changed, once, twice, as if a projector had clicked and the frame had jumped. His mouth fell open. His eyes, which had been watching the upper wall, focused on the foot of the bed as if something had just stepped into the room and waited for the occupant of a reserved seat. The priests, the brothers, the boy, all of them felt it at once, a pressure that curled around the ears like someone whispering cave silent words against the skin of the skull, saying not now, not yet. And as the command gathered itself once more, on a single name spoken with a simplicity that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with pleading, the light in the room seemed to shift a shade like a candle flame seized by a draft, and the boy, with perfect clarity, said, "He's here." The sentence hung there a moment, bead bright on the breath, and then broke against the room like a wave. Halloran's eyes flicked to the corner where the boy stared. He saw nothing. He felt the hair on his forearms lift as if a storm had uncapped the sky. The brothers swayed ever so slightly on their heels, as if the floor's pitch had changed beneath them. Father Bowdern leaned forward and did the smallest thing. He put 2 fingers on the boy's forehead, the way a mother checks a fever, and whispered a quiet assent. "All right." The words came as a reply through the boy, a voice that sounded like a man who had walked a long way in heavy boots. "Michael," it said, and then something that cannot be transcribed without becoming smaller than it was. A set of phrases reported later in diaries and interviews, a command to what held on, a naming of its place, a clear instruction to depart. It didn't last long. It didn't need to. The last sentence landed like a key turning. "Return to hell," the voice said, not in bombast, but with the casual fatigue of someone dispatching a rude guest. The convulsion that followed seemed to break the frame of the room. The bed slammed once. The straps pulled taut and then relaxed in a single elastic jerk. The boy's mouth went wide, and a cry came out of him that wasn't loud, but felt huge, as if someone had dropped a stone in a deep well and struck water that had been waiting undisturbed for years. Then silence. Not even the building's pipes dared remark. The crucifix on the wall cast a shadow that no longer moved. Bishop's pen scratched at last. He wrote, 10:45 p.m. The boy said, "He is gone." It was the voice of the boy, and not his other, pitched in the frightened wonder of someone who has just discovered that pain sometimes actually stops. He fell asleep as quickly as a child after fever, his face smoothed. Color rose in his skin. When he woke, he asked softly, like he remembered he was supposed to, "Can I have water?" His mother, whose knees had been aching for days, stood. She handed him the glass with both hands so it would not shake. There were no marks the next morning. No scratches rose at noon. He ate slowly, glanced at the window, practiced sitting up without watching the corners of the room. The brothers, tired beyond articulation, made their rounds and discovered that, after months of moving, as if through waist-deep water, they could walk again without feeling resistance. The bed did not move. After a week, his family brought him home. The Alexian brothers kept the room quiet. Years later, the hospital wing would be demolished. It gave rise to whispers that they had raised the room to erase a stain, as if plaster could hold what men feared. In truth, hospitals eat their own bricks, as a matter of course, and the wing's time had come. Still, in the demolition rubble, it was said a cross was found, scorched, and set aside. Stories love objects. People pass them around, like talismans against disbelief. The boy would grow as other boys grow. He would go back to school. He would learn to drive. He would work a job and change jobs. He would not, at least publicly, talk about this period the way people talk about lightning that has once found them. He would keep his own counsel. Interviews and articles would circle his anonymity for decades. Careful and not, skeptics would propose poltergeist activity, a phenomenon attached to adolescence, the mind pitching itself into the room with hands it doesn't fully control. Others would suggest a kind of temporary psychosis, a grief-blasted mind absorbing its elders' expectations, acting them out with terrible conviction. Some would point to the influence of suggestion, to Lutheran piety and Catholic formality, to a culture that expects signs and therefore sees them. When the young scholastic was older, a chaplain in wars and hospitals, he would answer questions with a soldier's circumspection. He saw what he saw, he would say. He did not see head spinning, impossible contortions, but he saw a bed he could not hold down with all his weight, and he saw marks he cannot explain, and he remembers the look on a young mother's face when the noise stopped. The story left their city and joined the greater story machine. In August of 1949, a Washington newspaper ran a headline that would become a signpost in the tale. Priest Freeze met Rainier Boy, reported held in devil's grip. 2 decades later, an alumnus of Georgetown University named William Peter Blatty read that story, or heard it from those who had, and wrote a novel that moved it into the bloodstream of the world. The novel found a camera, then a screen. The head turned, the pea soup flew, and an ancient ritual became a pop culture vernacular reshaped into fear. The true case got swallowed by its shadow and became something it never was and never wanted to be. What happened in 1949 remains, if you prefer, a human story. Grief came to a family, and children are porous to grief. They leak it in unbelievable ways. A series of unlikely and striking phenomena occurred in front of people, ordinary men mostly, with good shoes and calluses, and those men brought to the problem the tools they had. They walked, night after night, into a room that hurt to be in, and they stood between what a child could survive and what he could not. Whether you believe the adversary they named was precisely the adversary they faced will always depend on the shape of your own fears. What is true by any measure that cares for people? It ended. The boy slept. And those men did not ask to be made into heroes. They went back to parishes and halls and kitchens with bad light and did the next ordinary thing, which is sometimes the bravest. If you stand today on Grand Boulevard outside the college church and listen, you can almost hear the city that was streetcars and the calls of hawkers and the muezzin-like peal of a bell at odd hours, students moving quickly because it is late and they are late. If you turn north and pass under elms that have forgotten winter, you can imagine a night in March when a small family, tight as a fist, turned into a neighborhood and asked to be taken in. Their footsteps are gone. The people who answered them are gone. The room is gone. But the ways we answer what frightens us remain. We use the language our dead left us, not because it is magic, but because it is what we have, and sometimes it is enough. Somewhere, this is the part stories will always add, even when they are not needed. A boy, now grown old, wakes with a start from a dream he cannot remember and lies still in the dark and counts, not sheep, but breaths as he must have counted them at 12 or 13, or however old he truly was. He breathes in and out and says nothing. His room remains still. He does not look for marks. He closes his eyes and listens to the quiet, and it does not sound like it did, and that, in any world, counts as a kind of miracle.